The gunshot that shattered the saloon window wasn't meant for Martha Hayes, but the blood splatter on her apron told her she was close enough to the violence that had become her life. She pressed herself against the rough pine wall, heart hammering as Dutch Mercer's gang celebrated another successful robbery in the streets of South Pass City, Wyoming, their revolvers firing into the September sky of 1878 like it was Independence Day. Martha had been running with them for 8 months now, ever since her father's debts had forced her into Dutch's employment at his saloon, and eventually into his confidence as the gang's unwitting accomplice, keeping watch and passing messages while pretending to be nothing more than a barmaid scrubbing tables and pouring whiskey. She wiped the stranger's blood from her cheek with trembling fingers, watching through the broken window as the outlaws whooped and hollered, their saddlebags heavy with money stolen from the stagecoach that had been carrying payroll for the mining company. 3 men lay dead in the street, she'd heard someone say. 3 men who had families, who had woken up that morning expecting to see sunset. Martha's stomach turned violently, and she barely made it to the back door before she was sick in the dirt alley, her whole body shaking with the realization of what she'd become part of. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The voice made her jump, and she spun to find Morgan Trent leaning against the adjacent building, his weathered face shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. She knew him by reputation, a ranch hand who worked at the Sweetwater spread 15 miles north of town, a man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. His dark eyes held something she couldn't quite name, concern maybe, or recognition. "I'm fine," Martha said, straightening up and smoothing her skirts, trying to compose herself even as her hands shook. "Just the heat." "It's 60 degrees, Morgan said quietly, pushing off from the wall. He was tall, she noticed, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from honest work under the Wyoming sun. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed from stirrups and hard riding. "And you've got blood on your face that isn't yours." Martha's hand flew to her cheek and she scrubbed at it with her sleeve. "The window broke, flying glass. That's not how glass cuts." Morgan took a step closer, and Martha found herself backing up until her spine hit the saloon wall. But there was no threat in his posture, only a quiet intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through her carefully constructed lies. "I've been watching that gang tear this town apart for months now. I've been watching you too, Martha Hayes." The sound of her name on his lips startled her. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're not like them," Morgan said, his voice low and steady. "I know you flinch every time Dutch Mercer walks into a room. I know you water down the drinks you serve his men and pocket the difference to pay off your father's debts. I know you're trapped." Martha felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "If you know so much, then you know it's dangerous to talk to me. Dutch doesn't like his people having conversations he doesn't approve of. Dutch Mercer is going to get you killed," Morgan said bluntly. "Or worse, he's going to make you complicit in something you can't come back from, if you're not there already." The words hit her like a slap because they were true. Martha thought of the 3 men lying dead in the street, of the widows and orphans they'd left behind, of the dozens of other victims over the past months. She thought of the whispered plans she'd overheard just last night. Dutch and his second in command, Sila's plotting something big, something that would put them on the map permanently. They were planning to rob the bank on Saturday when the mining company made its monthly deposit, and they didn't care how many people got in their way. "I can't do anything about it," Martha whispered, "even if I wanted to." Morgan studied her for a long moment, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "Marshal's office in Lander, 30 miles east. If you ever decide you want out, if you ever decide you want to do the right thing, you ride there and you ask for Marshal Clayton Webb. You tell him Morgan Trent sent you and you tell him everything you know." "They'd hunt me down," Martha said, but she took the paper anyway, her fingers brushing against his calloused palm. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly. "Dutch doesn't forgive betrayal." "That's why you'd need protection," Morgan said. "That's why you'd need someone willing to stand between you and them." His eyes locked with hers, and Martha saw the unspoken offer there, the promise of something she'd thought she'd lost forever. A choice, a chance, a way forward that didn't end with her soul as stained as her apron. Before she could respond, the back door of the saloon slammed open and Silas emerged, his narrow face twisted with suspicion. "Martha, Dutch wants you inside, now." His gaze slid to Morgan, cold and calculating. "And you, ranch hand, you'd best move along, this isn't your part of town." Morgan tipped his hat slowly, his expression giving nothing away. "Just getting some air, no harm in that." But as he walked past Martha, he murmured so quietly only she could hear, "Saturday, before they make their move." Martha's heart lurched as she understood what he meant. She had 3 days to decide whether she was going to save innocent lives or save herself. 3 days to choose between the devil she knew and the cowboy who just offered her redemption. Inside the saloon, Dutch Mercer sat at his usual corner table, a king holding court in his kingdom of sawdust and sin. He was a handsome man in a cruel way, with sharp features and sharper eyes, his dark hair slicked back and his clothes finer than anyone else's in South Pass City. The money he'd stolen had bought him a veneer of respectability, at least among those who chose not to ask questions about where his wealth came from. "Martha, darling," Dutch said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Come sit with me. We need to discuss your future." Martha approached the table slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she'd learned to hide her fear behind a mask of compliance, and she slid into the chair across from him with practiced ease. "My future." "Your father's debts are almost paid off," Dutch said, pouring her a shot of whiskey. "Another month, maybe 2, and you'll have earned his freedom." He slid the glass toward her, and Martha took it with steady hands even though her insides were churning. "But I've been thinking, why should you leave? You're good at what you do. You listen, you remember things, you keep your mouth shut. Those are valuable qualities." "I appreciate the offer," Martha said carefully, "but once the debt is paid, I was hoping to move on. Maybe head to California, start fresh." Dutch's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "California, that's a dangerous journey for a woman alone. Bandits, hostile Indians, all manner of trouble. You'd need protection. I'm sure I could find a wagon train." "Or," Dutch said, leaning forward, "you could stay here, with me. I could use a woman like you, Martha. Smart, pretty, loyal." His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist before she could pull away, his grip just tight enough to hurt. "You are loyal, aren't you?" Martha met his gaze and forced herself not to flinch. "I've never given you reason to doubt it." "No," Dutch agreed, releasing her wrist slowly. "You haven't. But Silas tells me you were talking to that ranch hand in the alley, Morgan Trent. What did he want?" "Nothing," Martha said, her mind racing. "He asked if I was all right after the window broke. I told him I was fine and he left." Dutch studied her face for what felt like an eternity, and Martha kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will. Finally, he nodded. "Good. Because Morgan Trent is the kind of man who thinks he's better than the rest of us. The kind who might get ideas about playing hero. And heroes," Dutch said softly, dangerously, "have a tendency to end up dead in this town." The threat was clear, and Martha felt ice settle in her stomach. Not just for herself, but for Morgan, the cowboy who'd been foolish enough or brave enough to offer her a way out. "I understand. I knew you would, Dutch said, his smile returning. Now, Saturday, we have a big job. I need you here at the saloon, keeping things normal, making sure anyone who might be watching sees business as usual. Can you do that for me? Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. Inside, her mind was spinning with the weight of what she now knew for certain. Saturday. The bank. Innocent people caught in the crossfire just like those men in the street today. She thought of the piece of paper tucked into her pocket, of Morgan's steady gaze, of the choice that was no longer theoretical but immediate and terrifying. That night, Martha lay awake in the small room she rented above the dress shop, staring at the water-stained ceiling and listening to the sounds of South Pass City, settling into uneasy sleep. The mining town had boomed in recent years, swelling with fortune seekers and those who served them, but Dutch Mercer's gang had cast a shadow over everything. Their violence, a constant reminder that civilization was still just a thin veneer over chaos. She thought of her father, dying slowly of lung disease in a boarding house on the other side of town. The debts he'd accumulated through bad luck and worse judgment now almost paid through her degradation. She thought of the life she'd imagined for herself once, before everything had fallen apart, teaching school maybe, or running a boarding house, something honest and simple and clean. That dream felt impossibly distant now, separated from her by months of compromise and complicity. But Morgan Trent's words echoed in her mind. I know you're not like them. Was that true? Could she still claim any moral ground when she'd spent 8 months enabling murderers and thieves? Or was redemption something she could earn by making one choice, one terrible and brave decision to do the right thing regardless of the cost? Next morning, Martha woke with her mind made up. She dressed carefully, braiding her brown hair and pinning it up in a simple style, then wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders. The dress shop owner, Mrs. Chen, was already at work when Martha came downstairs, her nimble fingers flying over a hem. You're up early, Mrs. Chen said, glancing up with kind eyes. She was one of the few Chinese immigrants who'd stayed in South Pass City after the railroad work dried up, making a living with her extraordinary sewing skills. Going somewhere. Just to see my father, Martha said, which was true if incomplete. I'll be back this afternoon. Mrs. Chen nodded, but Martha caught the concern in her expression. Be careful, dear. There's been talk about Dutch Mercer's gang planning something. The whole town is nervous. Martha's chest tightened. If the townspeople suspected something was coming, how many would be on the streets Saturday when the shooting started? How many innocents would die because she'd stayed silent? I'll be careful, she promised, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The ride to Lander took her most of the day. Martha had borrowed a horse from the livery stable, telling the owner she needed to visit a sick relative, and the mare carried her steadily east across the rolling Wyoming landscape. The grassland stretched endlessly under a sky so vast and blue, it made her feel small and insignificant. Just one person trying to make one choice in a world that seemed determined to crush anything soft or decent. By the time she reached Lander, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The town was larger than South Pass City, more established, with actual law and order that didn't depend on who had the fastest draw. Martha tied her horse outside the marshal's office, took a deep breath that did nothing to steady her nerves, and walked inside. Marshal Clayton Webb was a man in his 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence to be easily fooled. He looked up from his desk as Martha entered, his expression neutral but assessing. "Help you, miss. Morgan Trent sent me," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said you could help." The marshal's demeanor shifted immediately, his posture straightening with interest. "Close the door and have a seat, Miss Hayes." Martha's eyes widened. "You know who I am." "Morgan sent word you might be coming," Marshal Webb said. "He rode out here yesterday, told me about your situation. Told me you might have information about Dutch Mercer's gang if you could be guaranteed protection." Martha sank into the chair across from his desk, relief and terror warring in her chest. Morgan had already started putting pieces in place to protect her, had risked his own safety to ride out here on her behalf. A man she barely knew was standing up for her when she could barely stand up for herself. "Saturday," she said, the words tumbling out now. "They're going to rob the bank in South Pass City on Saturday morning. Dutch said the mining company makes its monthly deposit then, and there will be thousands of dollars. They don't care who gets hurt." Marshal Webb's jaw tightened. "How many men?" "6 in the core gang," Martha said, her hands twisting in her lap. "Dutch Mercer, Silas Crawford, Jake Murphy, the Hollies brothers, and Ray Turner, but they have others who help them, informants and lookouts. The whole town is afraid of them. And you've been working in Dutch's saloon." "Against my will," Martha said quickly, desperately needing him to understand. "My father owed him money. I've been working off the debt, but I never wanted to be part of what they do. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." "But people have gotten hurt," Marshal Webb said, not unkindly but not letting her off easy either. "And you've been there while it happened." Martha felt tears burning behind her eyes. I know I should have come forward sooner. I was scared and weak, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, but 3 men died yesterday and I can't do that anymore. I can't let Saturday happen without trying to stop it." The marshal studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, here's what's going to happen. I'll get word to the territorial marshal's office and we'll have men in place Saturday morning. But Dutch Mercer can't know you're the one who told us. You'll have to go back to South Pass City, act normal, be exactly where Dutch expects you to be." "And after?" Martha asked. "After the gang is arrested or killed, what happens to me?" "That depends on whether you're willing to testify," Marshal Webb said. "With your testimony, we can make sure Dutch Mercer and his men hang for their crimes. But testifying means your name becomes public. It means everyone will know you're the one who turned them in." Martha thought of Dutch's cold eyes, of Silas's suspicious nature, of the network of outlaws and sympathizers who might decide to make her pay for her betrayal. She thought of spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering if every stranger was an assassin. "If I testify, I'll need protection, real protection." "I can arrange for you to be relocated," Marshal Webb said. "New name, new town, a chance to start over where Dutch Mercer's reputation won't follow you." "Alone," Martha said softly. It wasn't a question. She'd be alone again, cut off from everything and everyone she knew, her father included, a ghost in her own life. "Unless someone volunteers to go with you," a familiar voice said from the doorway. Martha's head whipped around to find Morgan Trent leaning against the doorframe, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, equal parts hope and disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Making sure you didn't have to do this alone," Morgan said, stepping fully into the office. He nodded to Marshal Webb, then turned his full attention to Martha. "I told you I'd stand between you and them. I meant it." "You barely know me," Martha protested, even as something warm and precious unfurled in her chest. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Morgan crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair so they were at eye level. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the sincerity that radiated from him like heat from a forge. "You're not a stranger," he said quietly. "I've been watching you for months, remember?" I've seen how you gentle spooked horses when you walk past the hitching post. I've seen you slip bread to hungry children when you think no one's looking. I've seen you carry the weight of other people's sins on your shoulders like you're personally responsible for every bad thing that happens in that saloon. Martha's breath caught in her throat. That doesn't explain why you'd throw away your whole life to protect me. Because you're trying to do the right thing, Morgan said simply. Because courage like that is rare and precious and worth protecting. Because from the first time I saw you, I thought you were the bravest person in South Pass City, surviving in a nest of vipers while keeping your soul intact. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, solid and real. And because life is short and uncertain, and when you see something worth fighting for, you fight. Martha stared at him, at this cowboy who'd somehow seen past her fear and shame to the person she was trying so desperately to be. "You're crazy," she whispered. "Probably," Morgan agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But I'm also right, you know you are." Marshal Webb cleared his throat. "Much as I hate to interrupt, we need to finalize the plan. Martha, can you be back in South Pass City by tomorrow afternoon?" Martha dragged her gaze away from Morgan's, though she didn't let go of his hand. "Yes, Dutch expects me at the saloon tomorrow evening." "Good. Act normal. Don't give them any reason to suspect. Saturday morning, when the shooting starts, you get yourself somewhere safe and stay there until it's over. Morgan will be with the posse, and once we have the gang in custody, we'll get you out of town immediately." Marshal Webb's expression softened slightly. "You're doing the right thing, Miss Hayes. I know it doesn't feel like it, but you're saving lives." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Her future suddenly split between the nightmare of her present and the possibility of something better. Something clean and honest with a cowboy who looked at her like she was worth saving. The ride back to South Pass City the next morning felt different. Morgan insisted on accompanying her most of the way, staying far enough behind that they wouldn't be seen together, but close enough to come running if she needed him. They stopped at a creek to water the horses, and Morgan finally rode up beside her, his expression troubled. "I need you to understand something," he said, swinging down from his saddle. "Saturday is going to be dangerous. Gunfights are chaos, and even with a plan, things can go wrong." "If something happens to me, don't," Martha interrupted, sliding off her own horse. The thought of Morgan being hurt, of this good man taking a bullet meant for her or anyone else, made her feel physically ill. "Don't talk like that. We have to," Morgan said gently. He stepped closer, and Martha found herself looking up at him, at the concern etched into his weathered features. "If something happens to me, you still testify. You still take that new life Marshal Webb is offering. You don't let my sacrifice be for nothing." "Your sacrifice," Martha repeated, anger suddenly flaring hot in her chest. "Is that what this is to you? Some noble gesture so you can die a hero?" "That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean?" Martha demanded, her voice rising. "Why are you really doing this, Morgan? Why risk everything for me?" Morgan stared at her for a long moment, something fierce and vulnerable flickering across his face. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached up and cupped her cheek with one calloused hand. "Because from the moment I first saw you, I felt like I'd been struck by lightning," he said quietly. "Because I've spent 8 months finding excuses to ride into town just to catch a glimpse of you through that saloon window. Because you make me want to be the kind of man who stands up and fights, instead of keeping his head down and playing it safe." Martha's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Morgan, I'm not asking you for anything," Morgan said quickly. "I know this is complicated and you've got enough to deal with without me adding to it. But I need you to know that this isn't just about doing the right thing. This is about you. This is about the fact that I've been half in love with you for months, and the thought of Dutch Mercer or anyone else hurting you makes me want to tear the world apart." Martha couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this impossible man who just handed her his heart like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You don't know me," she whispered, but the protest was weak because it was becoming less true by the moment. "Then let me," Morgan said. "After Saturday, when this is over, let me know you. Really know you. Give me the chance to prove I'm not crazy for feeling this way." Martha thought of all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could go wrong, all the danger and uncertainty that lay ahead. But she also thought of Morgan's steady presence, of the way he'd offered her protection without asking for anything in return, of the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who saw her for who she really was and chose her anyway. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, yes." The smile that broke across Morgan's face was like sunrise, warm and brilliant and full of promise. He leaned down slowly, telegraphing his intentions, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Martha didn't pull away. She rose up on her toes and met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was soft and sweet and tasted like hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Morgan rested his forehead against hers. "Saturday," he murmured. "We get through Saturday and then we get our chance." "Saturday," Martha agreed, and tried not to think about all the ways the world could end in the space between now and then. The last miles back to South Pass City were the longest of Martha's life. She parted ways with Morgan 5 miles outside town, watching him ride north toward the Sweetwater Ranch while she continued west alone. By the time she returned her borrowed horse to the livery and walked back to Mrs. Chen's dress shop, the sun was setting and her nerves were wound so tight she thought she might shatter. "You were gone a long time," Mrs. Chen observed when Martha slipped in through the back door. "Your father is all right. He's fine," Martha said, the lie sitting heavy on her tongue. She hadn't actually visited her father, had barely thought about him in the chaos of the past 2 days. Guilt added itself to the complicated mess of emotions churning in her gut. "I should go see him now, actually. Make sure he has everything he needs." Her father's boarding house was a sad, sagging building near the edge of town, home to miners who'd broken their bodies in pursuit of gold and silver. Samuel Hayes occupied a small room on the ground floor, his once robust frame now whittled down to skin and bone by the lung disease that was slowly suffocating him. He looked up when Martha entered, his eyes lighting with pleasure that made her guilt intensify. "Martha, girl," he rasped, struggling to sit up straighter in bed. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I wanted to make sure you were comfortable," Martha said, settling into the chair beside his bed. She poured him water from the pitcher on the nightstand and helped him drink, her heart breaking at how frail he'd become. "How are you feeling?" "Same as always," Samuel said, which meant terrible but determined not to complain. "How much longer?" He meant the debt, Martha knew. How much longer until she'd worked off what he owed and could be free of Dutch Mercer's control? "Soon," she said, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. After Saturday, either she'd be free or she'd be dead, and either way the debt would no longer matter. "Father, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whatever you hear about me, I want you to know I did what I thought was right." Samuel's faded eyes sharpened with concern. "Martha, what are you talking about? What have you done?" "Nothing yet," Martha said carefully, "but I might have to do something soon. Something that will make people angry. I can't tell you more than that, but I need you to trust me." Her father reached out with a trembling hand and grasped hers. "You're a good girl, Martha. You've always been good, even when life didn't give you any reason to be." Whatever you need to do, you do it. Don't worry about me." Tears finally spilled over, running hot down Martha's cheeks. "I love you, Papa. I love you too, girl, more than anything in this world." Martha sat with her father until he dozed off, then slipped back out into the gathering dark. South Pass City at night was a different beast than during the day, all shadows and suspicious sounds. The respectable citizens locked safely in their homes while those of questionable character took over the streets. Martha pulled her shawl tight and hurried toward the saloon, knowing Dutch would be expecting her for the evening shift. The saloon was already crowded when she arrived, miners and cowboys drinking away their earnings while Dutch held court at his usual table. He spotted Martha immediately, his expression sharpening with something that might have been suspicion or might have been her paranoid imagination. "Martha, come here." Martha wove through the crowd, hyper-aware of every eye on her, every potential threat. When she reached Dutch's table, she found Silas there too, his narrow face twisted with its perpetual distrust. "You wanted to see me. Where were you today?" Dutch asked, his tone casual but his eyes hard. "Someone said they saw you riding out of town yesterday morning." Martha's heart lurched, but she kept her expression neutral. "I went to see my father. He's not doing well, and I wanted to spend some time with him while I still can." "That's funny," Silas said, leaning back in his chair. "Because I sent someone to check on that, and your father said he hadn't seen you in 3 days. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Martha's mind raced, searching for an explanation that would satisfy them, but came up empty. She'd been so focused on the big picture that she'd forgotten to cover the small details, and now that oversight might cost her everything. "I went to his boarding house, but he was sleeping," she tried. "I didn't want to wake him." "Lying," Silas said flatly. He stood up, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "She's lying, Dutch. I told you she was trouble." "Sit down," Dutch said, his voice cold and commanding. Silas obeyed reluctantly, but his hand stayed near his weapon. Dutch turned his attention back to Martha, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You know what I think? I think you're scared. I think you heard about Saturday's job and you're getting cold feet. Maybe you rode out to the edge of town thinking about running, but then you remembered your father and realized you couldn't abandon him." It was a plausible explanation, and Martha seized on it with desperate relief. "You're right," she said, forcing her voice to shake convincingly. "I'm sorry, Dutch. I'm just scared. Yesterday, when those men died, it made everything feel too real. I panicked." "And where did you go when you panicked?" Silas pressed. "The old mining camp north of town," Martha lied, picking a location far from Lander. "I just rode there and sat and tried to think. I spent the night in one of the abandoned buildings and came back this morning." Dutch watched her for what felt like an eternity, and Martha held her breath, waiting for him to call her bluff, to pull his gun and end this right here. But finally, he nodded slowly. "I understand being scared. This is a big job and there's risk involved. But you need to understand something, Martha. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. If you run, if you betray us, there's nowhere you can go that I won't find you. And when I do, what happens to you will make your father's death look peaceful." The threat was crystal clear, and Martha felt ice settle in her veins. But she also felt a flicker of anger, hot and righteous, that this man thought he owned her, that he could threaten her family and expect her compliance. "I understand," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm not going to run." "Good," Dutch said, his smile returning like nothing had happened. "Then you'll be here Saturday morning, acting natural, making sure everything looks normal. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," Martha said, because what else could she say with Silas's hand still resting on his gun and the whole room full of men loyal to Dutch Mercer? The next 2 days were the longest of Martha's life. She went through the motions of her normal routine, serving drinks at the saloon, cleaning tables, smiling and chatting with customers while her insides churned with anticipation and terror. Every moment felt like it might be her last. Every glance from Sila's or comment from Dutch a potential sign that they'd figured out her betrayal. She didn't see Morgan, though she felt his presence like a phantom touch, knowing he was out there somewhere, working with Marshal Webb to prepare for Saturday's confrontation. The thought of him gave her strength during the darkest moments, when she was tempted to flee or give up or simply dissolve under the pressure of maintaining her facade. Friday night, Martha barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the creaks and groans of the building, every sound a potential threat, every shadow a possible assassin. When dawn finally broke over South Pass City on Saturday morning, she felt hollow and brittle, a shell of herself going through predetermined motions. She dressed carefully in her simplest dress, dark blue calico that wouldn't show bloodstains, then immediately hated herself for the thought. She braided her hair and pinned it up, ate a breakfast she couldn't taste, and walked to the saloon with her heart in her throat. Dutch was already there, along with the rest of the gang. They were checking their weapons, loading extra ammunition, their faces set with anticipation and barely contained violence. Dutch looked up when Martha entered, and she saw something calculating in his expression that made her blood run cold. "Martha," he said pleasantly, "come here, I have a job for you." Martha approached slowly, every nerve screaming danger. "What do you need?" "I need you to come with us," Dutch said, and Martha's world tilted sickeningly. "I've been thinking about what you said about being scared, and I realized the best way to make sure you don't lose your nerve is to bring you along. You'll be our lookout during the robbery. Stand outside the bank, keep watch, signal if you see any lawmen coming." "But you said you wanted me here at the saloon," Martha protested, her mind racing with panic. If she was at the bank when the shooting started, if she was standing with the gang when Marshal Webb's men arrived, she'd be caught in the crossfire. She'd be killed or arrested, and either way the plan would fall apart. "I changed my mind," Dutch said, his smile sharp as a knife. "Unless you have some objection." Martha stared at him and realized with sinking certainty that this was a test. Dutch suspected something, might not know exactly what, but suspected enough that he was forcing her hand. If she refused, she'd confirm his doubts. If she agreed, she'd be walking into a death trap of her own making. "No objection," she heard herself say. "I'll do whatever you need." "That's my girl," Dutch said, and the possessiveness in his tone made her skin crawl. The walk to the bank felt like a funeral procession. Martha moved in a daze of terror and desperate prayer, hoping that somehow Morgan and Marshal Webb would realize the plan had changed, that they'd adapt, that this wouldn't end with her body bleeding out in the dirt. The morning was beautiful, clear and cool with that crystalline quality that Wyoming autumn days sometimes had, and Martha thought dimly that it was a terrible day to die. The bank sat on the main street of South Pass City, a solid brick building that represented civilization and order in a town that had precious little of either. The mining company representative was due to arrive at 9 o'clock with the monthly deposit, and Dutch positioned his men carefully, some inside the bank, others scattered along the street in positions that would give them clear lines of fire. And Martha, he positioned directly in front of the bank's entrance, exposed and vulnerable, a living shield or a message or both. "You see anyone official looking, you come inside and tell me immediately," Dutch instructed, his hand gripping her shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Don't try to signal them, don't try to warn them, just tell me. Understand?" "Yes," Martha whispered, Dutch studied her face one more time, then nodded and disappeared into the bank with Silas and Jake Murphy. The Hollies brothers took up positions in the alley across the street, and Ray Turner mounted his horse at the end of the block, ready to signal when the mining company wagon arrived. Martha stood alone in the morning sunlight, her hands clasped together to hide their shaking, and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Around her, South Pass City was waking up, shopkeepers opening their doors, early risers heading to the general store or the post office, all of them oblivious to the violence about to erupt in their midst. Then she saw him. Morgan, riding slowly down the street on his rangy buckskin horse, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes scanning everything, cataloging threats and positions. Behind him, spread out to look casual but clearly coordinated, were a dozen other riders, all armed, all wearing the determined expressions of men who'd come to do a hard job. Martha's breath caught. Marshal Webb's posse, arriving right on schedule, except Martha was standing in front of the bank like a target in a shooting gallery, and everything was wrong, wrong, wrong. Morgan's gaze found hers, and Martha saw the flash of alarm in his eyes as he realized where she was. She couldn't signal him, couldn't warn him that the gang was inside and waiting, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch as the whole carefully constructed plan began to crumble. The mining company wagon turned onto the main street from the opposite direction, its armed guards riding alongside, completely unaware of what awaited them. Ray Turner spurred his horse forward to signal Dutch, and everything happened at once. The bank doors burst open and Dutch emerged with his gun drawn, Silas and Jake right behind him. The Hollies brothers opened fire from the alley, and the mining company guards were caught in a deadly crossfire. People on the street screamed and scattered, diving for cover as bullets tore through the morning air. Martha stood frozen for a heartbeat that lasted forever. Then Morgan was there, his horse nearly trampling her as he wheeled between her and the bank, his own weapon coming up to return fire. "Get down," he shouted, and Martha finally moved, dropping to the dirt and crawling behind a water trough as chaos erupted around her. The shooting was deafening, a cacophony of gunfire and shouting and screaming that seemed to go on forever. Martha pressed herself against the rough wood of the trough, her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face as she prayed desperately that Morgan wouldn't be killed protecting her, that innocent people wouldn't die because she tried to do the right thing. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, she could see fragments of the battle. Morgan and the other posse members had taken cover and were exchanging fire with Dutch's gang. The mining company guards had recovered from their initial shock and were fighting back. Townsfolk were caught in the middle, scrambling for safety as bullets ricocheted off storefronts and shattered windows. Then Martha saw Dutch, his face twisted with rage, emerging from the bank and scanning the street with deadly intent. His gaze found the water trough where Martha was hiding, and recognition flared in his eyes along with something murderous. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at her hiding place, and Martha knew with sick certainty that he was going to kill her for her betrayal. The shot rang out, loud even among all the other gunfire, but the impact never came. Martha's eyes flew open to see Dutch staggering backward, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He looked down at the wound with almost comical surprise, then collapsed onto the wooden sidewalk and moved no more. Martha's head whipped around to find Morgan still mounted, his smoking revolver trained on where Dutch had been standing, his face set in grim lines. He'd killed Dutch Mercer, had taken a life to save hers, and Martha felt the weight of that sacrifice settle into her bones. The rest of the gang, seeing their leader fall, began to falter. Jake Murphy threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. The Hollies brothers tried to run and were cut down by the posse. Ray Turner spurred his horse in a desperate attempt to escape, but was shot from the saddle before he made it 10 feet. Only Silas continued fighting, his gun blazing with desperate fury, until a bullet from Marshal Webb's rifle caught him in the shoulder and spun him around. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up. And then, impossibly, it was over. The gunfire stuttered to a halt, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the shocked silence of survivors processing what they'd just lived through. Martha stayed behind the water trough, trembling so hard her teeth chattered, unable to make herself move. "Martha," Morgan's voice gentle and urgent. "Martha, it's over. You're safe." She looked up to find him dismounted and kneeling beside her, his face streaked with powder smoke and his eyes full of concern. Without thinking, Martha threw herself into his arms, burying her face against his chest as sobs racked her body. Morgan held her tight, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances that she couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears. "I've got you," he said over and over. "I've got you. You're safe now. I've got you." Marshal Webb appeared beside them, his expression grim but satisfied. "Miss Hayes, we need to get you out of here. There might be sympathizers in the crowd, and until we've secured the situation, you're still at risk." Morgan helped Martha to her feet, keeping one arm around her waist when her legs threatened to buckle. "My horse," he said. "We can ride double to my ranch. It's far enough from town to be safe." "Go," Marshal Webb agreed. "I'll handle things here and send word when it's secure." Morgan boosted Martha onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his solid warmth at her back the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. They rode out of South Pass City at a gallop, leaving behind the chaos and blood and the body of Dutch Mercer cooling in the morning sun. The Sweetwater Ranch was everything South Pass City wasn't: peaceful, clean, honest. The main house was a simple structure of weathered wood with a wide porch and curtains in the windows, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of hard work and modest success. Morgan's boss, an older man named Henry Walsh, took one look at Martha's shock-white face and disappeared into the house without asking questions, giving them privacy. Morgan led Martha to the porch and settled her into a rocking chair, then went inside and returned with a blanket and a cup of water. Martha accepted both with numb gratitude, wrapping the blanket around herself despite the warmth of the day, her body unable to stop shaking. "You killed him," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "You killed Dutch Mercer for me." Morgan crouched in front of her chair, his expression troubled. "He was going to kill you. I didn't have a choice." "You did," Martha said, tears spilling over again. "You could have let me die. You could have protected yourself, but you killed a man to save me." "And I'd do it again," Morgan said fiercely. He took her hands in his, chafing them gently as if he could warm away her shock through friction alone. "Martha, listen to me. You did something incredibly brave today. You saved lives. That mining company wagon had 3 guards, and if Dutch's gang had surprised them without warning, they'd all be dead. The bank teller, the customers inside, innocent people going about their mourning, they'd all have been caught in the crossfire. You prevented that." "People still got hurt," Martha whispered. "I saw the guards shooting and the gang, and there was so much blood." "The Hollies brothers and Ray Turner are dead," Morgan said quietly. "Jake Murphy is in custody with a minor wound, and Silas Crawford is badly injured but will live to stand trial. 2 of the mining company guards took bullets, but the doctor thinks they'll pull through. And not a single innocent bystander was killed, Martha. Not one. Because you warned us. Because you were brave enough to betray the gang and give us the information we needed to be prepared." Martha wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that she'd done the right thing, but all she could see was Dutch's face in that final moment, the shock and rage as he realized she'd betrayed him, the blood spreading across his chest. "I'm glad he's dead," she said, the confession spilling out. "Is that terrible? I'm glad Dutch Mercer is dead and can never hurt anyone again." "That's not terrible," Morgan said gently. "That's human. He was a bad man who did bad things, and the world is better without him in it. You don't have to feel guilty for surviving, Martha. You don't have to feel guilty for being glad it's over." They sat in silence for a while, Martha slowly drinking her water while Morgan kept his steady presence beside her, not pushing, not demanding, just being there. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and gradually Martha's shaking subsided, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made her feel like she might dissolve into the porch boards. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you rest," Morgan said. "Marshal Webb will want your testimony eventually, but that can wait a few days. You'll stay here where it's safe, and I'll make sure nothing and no one gets near you." "Your boss won't mind. Henry's a good man," Morgan said. "He knows what it's like to need help. He'll understand." Martha studied Morgan's face, this cowboy who'd appended his life to protect her, who'd killed for her, who'd offered her a future when she'd thought she had none. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why did you really do all this? The truth, Morgan, not the noble reasons or the right thing to do." "The real reason." Morgan was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Then he reached up and cupped her face gently, his calloused thumb brushing away the tear tracks on her cheek. "Because from the moment I saw you, I knew," he said simply. "I knew you were going to change my life. I knew I'd found something precious and rare, and I couldn't just walk away and let Dutch Mercer destroy it. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to save you." "You didn't know if I was worth saving," Martha pointed out, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I did," Morgan said with absolute certainty. "I saw it in every small kindness you showed when you thought no one was watching. I saw it in the way you carried yourself, like you were fighting to hold on to something essential even in the worst circumstances. I saw it in your eyes every time you looked at Dutch and his men, the disgust and fear you tried so hard to hide. You were worth saving, Martha Hayes. You are worth saving, and I'm going to spend as long as you'll let me proving that to you." Martha felt something crack open in her chest, the armor she'd built around her heart shattering under the weight of Morgan's sincerity. "I'm broken," she whispered. "I've done things, been complicit in things that I can never take back. I'm not the person you think I am." "You're exactly the person I think you are," Morgan said. "Brave and strong and fighting to do right even when it costs you everything. The things that happened, the things you survived, they don't define you, Martha. What defines you is that when it mattered, when innocent lives were on the line, you chose to act. You chose to risk everything to save people you didn't even know. That's who you are." Martha stared at him through her tears, seeing the truth written plainly on his face. Morgan Trent believed every word he was saying. He saw something in her worth fighting for, worth killing for, worth building a life around. And maybe, just maybe, she could start believing it too. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be the person you think I am." "You don't have to figure it out alone," Morgan said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. You don't have to carry this by yourself anymore. I'm here, Martha. I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out together." "Together," Martha repeated, testing the word. It felt foreign and precious, like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. But Morgan was offering it anyway, his steady gaze promising that he meant every word. "Together," Morgan confirmed. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was different from their kiss by the creek, deeper and more certain, a promise sealed with touch. Martha melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself to him as everything else spun away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Morgan rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he murmured. "Not just for today or tomorrow. Stay here at the ranch. Build a life with me." "You're asking me to marry you," Martha said, her heart stuttering. "Eventually," Morgan said with a small smile. "When you're ready. When the nightmares fade and you've had time to figure out who you are outside of survival mode. But yes, Martha Hayes, when the time is right, I'm going to ask you to marry me, and I'm hoping like hell you'll say yes." Martha laughed, the sound startled out of her, high and slightly hysterical but real. "You're completely insane." "About you, absolutely," Morgan agreed cheerfully, "but you like me anyway." "I barely know you," Martha protested weakly. "Then stay and get to know me," Morgan said. "Give us a chance to build something real and honest and good. You deserve that, Martha. You deserve a life that isn't about fear and survival. You deserve to be happy." Martha thought about her father, dying slowly in his boarding house. She thought about South Pass City and the memories that would haunt her there. She thought about the possibility of starting over, of building something new with this impossible cowboy who looked at her like she hung the moon. "My father," she said. "He's sick. I can't just abandon him." "We'll bring him here," Morgan said immediately. "Henry has spare rooms in the bunkhouse, and the doctor in Lander is better than whatever quack your father's seeing now. We'll make sure he's comfortable, that he has everything he needs. You won't have to choose between him and your future." Tears spilled over again, but this time they were different, softer, tinged with something that might have been hope. "You've thought of everything." "I've had months to think about it," Morgan admitted. "Months of watching you and wanting to help and trying to figure out how to offer you a way out. This isn't impulsive, Martha. This is me knowing what I want and going after it." "And what you want is me," Martha said, still not quite believing it. "What I want is you," Morgan confirmed. "Broken pieces and all. The real you, not some idealized version. I want your strength and your vulnerability. I want your laugh and your tears. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm building a life with the bravest woman I've ever met." He pulled back slightly to look her full in the face, his expression so sincere it made her chest ache. "So what do you say, Martha Hayes? Will you stay?" Martha took a shaky breath, looking past Morgan to the ranch spread out before them, the horses grazing peacefully in the corrals, the mountains rising majestically in the distance, the vast Wyoming sky arching overhead like a promise of endless possibility. She thought about the alternative, testifying and being relocated to some distant town where she'd be alone and anonymous, forever looking over her shoulder, forever haunted by what she'd survived. Then she looked back at Morgan, at his steady presence and honest eyes, at the future he was offering laid out like a gift. "Yes," she said, the word barely a whisper but carrying the weight of complete surrender. "Yes, I'll stay." The smile that broke across Morgan's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, brilliant and warm and full of joy. He pulled her up out of the rocking chair and into his arms, spinning her around despite her startled laugh, then set her down gently and kissed her again, soft and sweet and full of promise. "You won't regret this," he murmured against her lips. "I swear to you, Martha, you won't regret this." "I hope not," Martha said, but she was smiling too, feeling something unfamiliar and precious unfurling in her chest. Hope, she realized. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt genuine hope for the future. The next few days passed in a strange blur of recovery and adjustment. Marshall Webb rode out to the Sweetwater Ranch to take Martha's formal statement, and she spent hours recounting everything she knew about Dutch Mercer's gang, their crimes, their associates, the network of fear they'd built across South Pass City. It was exhausting and painful, forcing her to relive every moment of her 8-month nightmare, but Marshal Webb was patient and professional, and Morgan sat beside her the entire time, his hand warm in hers. "With your testimony, we can clean up South Pass City properly," Marshal Webb said when they were finished. "There are at least a dozen people who aided the gang in various ways, and now we have the evidence to charge them. You've done this territory a great service, Miss Hayes." "Will I need to testify in court?" Martha asked, dreading the thought of facing down the survivors and sympathizers in a public trial. "Probably," Marshal Webb admitted, "but not for a while. Jake Murphy is cooperating in hopes of a lighter sentence, and his testimony combined with yours should be enough to convict anyone we bring charges against. And I'll make sure you have protection every step of the way." After Marshal Webb left, Morgan took Martha into Lander to see a proper doctor about her father. They made the journey on horseback, riding together on Morgan's buckskin with Martha seated in front of him, his arms creating a protective circle around her. It felt safe and right in a way she'd never experienced, like she was exactly where she belonged. The doctor in Lander confirmed what Martha had feared. Her father's condition was terminal, the damage to his lungs too extensive to reverse. But he also prescribed better medication for the pain and recommended a regimen that might give Samuel Hayes a few more comfortable months. Morgan paid for everything without hesitation, and when Martha tried to protest, he simply shook his head. "He's your father," Morgan said. "That makes him my responsibility too. Don't worry about the money, Martha. We'll figure it out." They arranged to move Samuel Hayes to the Sweetwater Ranch the following week, once Henry Walsh had prepared appropriate accommodations. In the meantime, Martha wrote her father a letter explaining everything: the betrayal, the shooting, the new life she was building with Morgan. She poured her heart onto the page, hoping he would understand, hoping he would forgive her for the choices she'd made. Back at the ranch, Martha slowly began to settle into a routine. She helped Henry's wife Clara with the cooking and cleaning, grateful for honest work that didn't involve Dutch Mercer or his gang. She learned to ride properly, spending hours in the saddle with Morgan teaching her, his patience inexhaustible even when she was frustrated with her own clumsiness. She watched the sun set over the mountains and listened to the coyotes singing at night, and gradually the knot of tension in her chest began to loosen. Morgan was true to his word, never pushing, never demanding more than she was ready to give. They talked for hours, sharing their histories and hopes, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Martha told him about her mother, who died when Martha was 12, about growing up in a series of rough mining towns, about the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher. Morgan talked about his own childhood on a farm in Missouri, about coming west after his parents died, about the satisfaction he found in honest work and open spaces. "I never wanted to be rich or famous," Morgan said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I just wanted to work hard, sleep sound, and know I was making a difference in my own small way, building something that mattered." "And now?" Martha asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Now I want all that," Morgan said, wrapping his arm around her, "but I want it with you. I want to build something together, a home, a family, a life that's about more than just surviving." Martha turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. "I want that too," she admitted. "I'm still scared and I still have nightmares about Dutch and the shooting, but I want to try. I want to believe we can have something good." "We can," Morgan said with quiet confidence. "We will. I promise you, Martha, we will." 3 weeks after the shooting, Samuel Hayes arrived at the Sweetwater Ranch, transported carefully in a wagon Henry had borrowed for the purpose. He was frailer than ever, but his eyes were bright with curiosity as he took in the ranch, the mountains, the clean air so different from the dusty confines of his boarding house. "So this is where my daughter is building her new life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Papa," Martha said, helping him down from the wagon with Morgan's assistance. "Let me show you your room. Clara and Henry have made it very comfortable." But Samuel stopped her, his gaze moving to Morgan with assessing intensity. "You're the one who saved her, the one who killed Dutch Mercer." "Yes, sir," Morgan said, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "I'd do it again without hesitation." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. Martha deserves a man who'll fight for her, a man who sees her worth." He reached out with a trembling hand and gripped Morgan's shoulder. "You take care of my girl, you understand. She's the best thing in my life, and I need to know she'll be loved when I'm gone." "I will," Morgan promised. "You have my word, sir." "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she knows how precious she is." Tears streamed down Martha's face as she watched the two most important men in her life come to an understanding. Her father was dying, and Morgan was promising to fill the void he'd leave behind, and it was almost too much emotion to contain. Samuel pulled her into a gentle hug, and Martha clung to him, breathing in his familiar scent, memorizing every detail for the hard days ahead. "You did good, Martha girl," Samuel whispered in her ear. "You saved lives and found love and gave yourself a chance at happiness. I'm so proud of you." "I love you, Papa," Martha choked out. "I love you too. Now let's see this room everyone keeps talking about." Samuel Hayes lived for 2 more months, fading gradually but peacefully, surrounded by people who cared for him and with his daughter holding his hand. He died on a crisp November morning with the first snow of the season dusting the mountains, and Martha sat beside his bed until the very end, whispering stories of her mother and promising that she'd be happy, that she'd build the life he'd wanted for her. Morgan made the arrangements for the burial, and Samuel Hayes was laid to rest in the small cemetery outside Lander, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross. Martha stood in the cold wind and said goodbye to her father, to her old life, to the weight of debt and obligation that had defined her for so long. She felt hollowed out and raw, but also strangely free, like a snake shedding its skin to reveal something new underneath. "He was a good man," Morgan said quietly, his arm around her shoulders. "He just had bad luck." "He had me," Martha said, "and at the end that was enough. He died knowing I was safe and loved. That's more than a lot of people get." They rode back to the Sweetwater Ranch in silence, and that night Martha finally let herself truly grieve, sobbing in Morgan's arms until she had nothing left. He held her through it all, stroking her hair and murmuring comfort, his strength a bulwark against the storm of her emotions. "I've got you," he kept saying. "I've got you, Martha. You're not alone, I've got you." And slowly, gradually, Martha began to believe him. She began to believe that maybe she could have this, could have happiness and peace and a future that wasn't defined by fear and survival. She began to believe that Morgan Trent was exactly what he seemed. A good man who loved her, who'd chosen her, who was committed to building a life together no matter how hard the journey. Winter settled over Wyoming, and with it came a different kind of healing. Martha threw herself into life at the ranch, learning to cook Henry's favorite meals, helping Clara with the endless mending, even trying her hand at some of the lighter ranch work under Morgan's patient tutelage. She was terrible at roping and barely adequate at branding, but she loved being outside in the clean air, loved the satisfaction of honest work, loved the way Morgan looked at her like she was the most capable woman in the territory, even when she was clearly struggling. They courted properly through the winter months, Morgan following all the social conventions even though they were living under the same roof. He asked permission before kissing her, kept their physical relationship chaste, and made it clear to Henry and Clara that he intended to marry Martha as soon as she was ready. It was old-fashioned and probably unnecessary given what they'd already been through together, but Martha appreciated the gesture, the way Morgan was giving her time and space to heal before pushing for more. Christmas came, and Morgan surprised her with a simple gold locket that had belonged to his mother. Inside, he'd placed a tiny photograph of the two of them taken in Lander by a traveling photographer. "So you'll always have a reminder," Morgan said as he clasped it around her neck. "That you're not alone anymore, that you have someone who loves you completely." Martha touched the locket with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I have something for you too," she said shyly, pulling out the package she'd hidden in her room. Inside was a shirt she'd sewn herself with Clara's help, made from soft blue fabric that matched Morgan's eyes. "It's not much, but I wanted to make you something with my own hands." Morgan unfolded the shirt with reverence, running his fingers over the careful stitches. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're perfect." "I'm really not," Martha said, but she was smiling. "You are to me," Morgan insisted. He set the shirt aside and pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that made her toes curl. "Marry me," he murmured against her lips. "I know we said we'd wait, but I can't wait anymore. Marry me, Martha. Make me the happiest man in Wyoming." Martha pulled back to look at him, seeing the love and hope shining in his eyes. She thought about everything they'd been through, the violence and fear and grief that had brought them together. She thought about the future stretching ahead, full of possibility and promise. She thought about the fact that she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. "Yes," she said, laughing through happy tears. "Yes, Morgan, I'll marry you." They were married in Lander on a bright February day in 1879, with Henry and Clara standing as witnesses and half the town turning out to see the union of the cowboy and the woman who'd brought down Dutch Mercer's gang. Martha wore a simple white dress that Clara had helped her sew, and Morgan wore his new blue shirt. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Morgan kissed her with such joy that the crowd burst into applause. The celebration afterward was modest but heartfelt, with music and dancing and more food than Martha had seen in months. People came up to congratulate them, to thank Martha for her bravery, to welcome her officially into the community. She was no longer the outlaw's accomplice or the woman in hiding. She was Martha Trent, wife of Morgan Trent, a respectable woman building an honest life. That night, in the hotel room Morgan had rented for their wedding night, he made love to her with exquisite tenderness, taking his time to learn every inch of her body, whispering words of love and devotion, until Martha thought her heart might burst. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, and Martha felt a contentment so profound it was almost frightening. "I never thought I could have this," she whispered, tracing patterns on Morgan's chest. "I never thought I deserved happiness." "You deserve everything," Morgan said, capturing her hand and bringing it to his lips. "And I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you know it." They returned to the Sweetwater Ranch as husband and wife, and life settled into a new rhythm. Spring came, bringing with it the hard work of calving season and the endless tasks of ranch maintenance. Henry, recognizing Morgan's dedication and skill, made him foreman with a promise that eventually he could buy into the ranch as a partner. It was more opportunity than Morgan had dared hope for, and he threw himself into the work with renewed vigor. Martha, meanwhile, discovered a talent for keeping the ranch's books and managing supplies. Her months working in Dutch's saloon had taught her arithmetic and organization. skills that translated surprisingly well to legitimate business. She also started teaching reading and writing to some of the ranch hands who'd never had formal education, fulfilling in a small way her old dream of being a teacher. In May, Martha realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror, memories of her own difficult childhood warring with hope for the future. Morgan was overjoyed, immediately becoming overprotective and fussing over her until she had to gently remind him that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, and Martha bloomed with health and happiness. She and Morgan spent long evenings on the porch talking about names and the future, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about the life they were building for their child. Morgan built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Clara helped Martha sew tiny clothes and blankets. In January of 1880, almost exactly 2 years after the shooting that had changed everything, Martha went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when she was terrified that something would go wrong, that she'd lose this precious new life before ever getting to hold it. But Morgan was there the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. And finally, as the sun rose over the snow-covered mountains, Martha gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel Morgan Trent, honoring both her father and his own, and when Morgan placed the tiny bundle in Martha's arms, she looked down at her son's perfect face and felt something click into place deep in her soul. This was why she'd survived. This was why she'd been brave enough to betray the gang and save innocent lives. So she could have this moment, this family, this chance to raise a child in love and safety. "He's beautiful," Morgan said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at his wife and son. "You're both so beautiful." "We made a person," Martha said wonderingly, touching Samuel's tiny hand and watching his fingers curl around hers. "We made a whole new person, Morgan." "We did," Morgan agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping his arms around both of them. "And we're going to give him the best life we possibly can, safety and love and all the opportunities we never had." "And brothers and sisters?" Martha asked, glancing up at him with a tired smile. "I don't want him to be lonely." "As many as you want," Morgan promised, kissing her forehead. "We'll fill this ranch with children and love and laughter. We'll build something beautiful, Martha. We already have." And they did. Over the next years, Martha and Morgan had 3 more children. A daughter they named Clara Rose after the woman who'd been so kind to Martha in her darkest days, and then twin boys they called Henry James and William Thomas. The ranch prospered, and Morgan eventually bought into partnership with Henry Walsh, renaming it the Trent Walsh Cattle Company. They expanded the operation, bought adjacent land, and became one of the most respected ranching families in the territory. Martha continued teaching, eventually starting a proper school for ranch children in the area, fulfilling her old dream in ways she'd never imagined. She wrote a memoir about her experiences with Dutch Mercer's gang, though she published it anonymously, using the proceeds to fund education initiatives and aid for families of crime victims. She never forgot where she'd come from or the price others had paid for her redemption. Jake Murphy, the only surviving member of Dutch's gang besides the wounded Silas Crawford, served 15 years in prison and emerged a changed man. He sought Martha out to apologize, and though it was difficult, she found it in herself to forgive him, recognizing that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. Silas Crawford died in prison of infection from his wounds, unrepentant to the end. South Pass City slowly recovered from the shadow Dutch Mercer had cast over it, becoming a quieter, more respectable town as the mining boom faded. Martha visited occasionally, always with Morgan at her side, and each time she was struck by how different everything looked now that she was no longer afraid. The saloon where she'd worked had been converted to a boarding house, the bank had been rebuilt, and life went on as it always did, people finding ways to survive and thrive despite hardship. On a warm summer evening in 1895, Martha sat on the porch of the home she and Morgan had built on their section of the ranch, watching her grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel was 25 now, married with 2 children of his own and running the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Clara Rose was teaching at the school Martha had founded, engaged to a lawyer from Lander. The twins were both working the ranch alongside their father and older brother, good boys turning into fine men. Morgan emerged from the house with 2 glasses of lemonade, settling into the rocking chair beside hers with a contented sigh. He was 52 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray, his face weathered by years of Wyoming sun and wind. But his eyes were still the same, still looking at Martha like she was the most precious thing in his world. "Happy?" he asked, reaching over to take her hand. Martha squeezed his fingers, looking out over the life they'd built together. The ranch house they'd expanded over the years, the barns and corrals, the fields where cattle grazed peacefully, the mountains rising majestically in the distance. She thought about the terrified young woman she'd been 17 years ago, convinced she was beyond redemption, certain she had no future worth fighting for. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Martha said, turning to smile at her husband. "I look at all this, at our children and grandchildren, at the life we've built, and I can hardly believe it's real, that I get to have this." "You deserve every bit of it," Morgan said, raising her hand to his lips. "You earned this, Martha. Through courage and sacrifice and choosing to do right even when it cost you everything." "We earned it," Martha corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Morgan. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "Then we saved each other," Morgan said softly. "Because you gave me something to fight for. You gave my life meaning and purpose beyond just existing. You made me brave." They sat in companionable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. The grandchildren's laughter drifted up from the yard, mixing with the sounds of horses and cattle and the endless Wyoming wind. It was an ordinary moment in an ordinary life, and Martha treasured it with all her heart because she knew better than most how rare and precious ordinary could be. "Do you ever regret it?" Morgan asked quietly. "Everything you went through, the violence and fear and grief." Martha considered the question carefully. Did she regret the terror of those months with Dutch Mercer's gang? Did she regret the nightmares that had plagued her for years afterward? Did she regret the blood on her hands, even indirectly, from being complicit in the gang's crimes? "No," she said finally. "I regret that innocent people suffered. I regret not being brave enough to act sooner, but I don't regret the path that led me here to you, to this life. Everything I survived made me who I am. It taught me what I'm capable of. It showed me what really matters." "And what's that?" Morgan asked, though she knew he already knew the answer. "Love," Martha said simply. "Family, standing up for what's right even when it's terrifying. Building something honest and good that will outlast us. That's what matters, Morgan. That's what makes all the rest worth surviving." Morgan pulled her close, and Martha leaned against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and soap and home. They'd been married 16 years, but she still got butterflies when he touched her, still felt that spark of connection that had drawn them together from the very beginning. "I love you, Martha Trent," Morgan murmured against her hair. From that first moment, I saw you through the saloon window, fighting to keep your dignity in an impossible situation. I loved you, and I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for giving me a reason to be brave." They stayed on the porch until full dark, talking and dreaming and planning for the future. They discussed expanding the school, maybe bringing in more teachers to serve a wider area. They talked about the new irrigation techniques Henry's son was experimenting with, and whether they should try them on their own fields. They argued playfully about whether Samuel should name his expected third child after Morgan's mother or Martha's, both of them secretly hoping for either. It was mundane and beautiful, the kind of conversation that filled a lifetime of marriage, full of shared history and inside jokes, and the comfortable shorthand of people who knew each other's hearts. And through it all, Martha felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. Gratitude for every moment, every breath, every ordinary miracle that made up her extraordinary life. Later that night, lying in bed with Morgan's arms around her, Martha thought back to that terrified young woman standing in the alley behind Dutch Mercer's saloon, covered in a stranger's blood and convinced her life was over. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, would she believe it? Would she believe that the cowboy offering her redemption would become the love of her life, her partner, the father of her children, and the foundation of everything good she'd ever built? Probably not. That woman had been too beaten down, too convinced of her own worthlessness to imagine happiness on this scale, but she'd been brave anyway. She'd taken the chance Morgan offered, had chosen to risk everything to save innocent lives, and in doing so had saved herself. "What are you thinking about?" Morgan asked sleepily, his breath warm against her neck. "About courage," Martha said softly. "About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help, accept love, accept that you deserve better than what you've settled for." Morgan hummed agreement, his arms tightening around her. "And sometimes the bravest thing is offering that help in the first place, taking a chance on someone even when you don't know if it'll work out." "Did you know?" Martha asked, turning in his arms to face him. "Back then, when you first offered to help me, did you know it would turn out like this?" "I hoped," Morgan said, his eyes opening to meet hers in the moonlight. "I couldn't know for sure, but I hoped that if I could just get you away from Dutch, give you a chance to breathe and heal, that maybe we'd have a shot at something real. And every day since then, you've proven that my hope was justified. You've been everything I dreamed of and so much more." Martha kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of 16 years of love and gratitude. "We have a good life," she murmured against his lips. "The best life," Morgan agreed. "And it's only going to get better as we watch our children grow and build lives of their own. As we get to be the old folks on the porch dispensing wisdom and spoiling grandchildren." "You say that like we're not already the old folks on the porch," Martha teased. "We're distinguished," Morgan corrected with mock dignity. "Respected pillars of the community, not old." Martha laughed, the sound bubbling up freely, no longer the restrained, careful laugh of a woman afraid to draw attention to herself. She was free now, truly free, and she never took that freedom for granted. Every laugh, every moment of joy, every ordinary day was a gift she'd earned through fire and fear and the courage to choose better. They fell asleep tangled together, and Martha's dreams were peaceful, full of sunshine and children's laughter and Morgan's steady presence. The nightmares that had once haunted her sleep had faded over the years, replaced by contentment and security and the absolute certainty that she was loved. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Samuel and his wife had 5 children eventually, giving Martha and Morgan a house full of grandchildren to dote on. Clara Rose married her lawyer and moved to Cheyenne, where she worked for women's suffrage and wrote fierce editorials about justice and equality. The twins both found wives and built homes on the ranch, keeping the family close and the business thriving. Martha continued teaching until she was 70, finally retiring when her knees made standing for long periods too difficult. Morgan worked the ranch until he was 75, only stepping back when Henry Walsh's grandson, who'd inherited his section of the partnership, gently suggested that perhaps Morgan had earned some rest. They spent their final years exactly as they'd spent so many evenings before. On the porch, holding hands, watching the sun set over the mountains, surrounded by family and love. Morgan died peacefully in his sleep at age 82, with Martha beside him and their children gathered close. Martha held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, whispering all the things she loved about him, all the ways he'd made her life beautiful, all the gratitude she carried for the cowboy who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. She lived 3 more years after Morgan's death, those years colored by grief, but also by joy at seeing her great-grandchildren born and watching her family continue to flourish. She spent her days telling stories to anyone who would listen, passing down the history of the ranch and the territory, making sure the next generation understood the cost of the freedom and prosperity they enjoyed. On a crisp October morning in 1912, Martha Hayes Trent died in her sleep, surrounded by photographs of her family and with Morgan's mother's locket still around her neck. She was 83 years old, and she'd lived 54 years beyond that terrible day when she'd stood in front of a bank and chosen courage over compliance, redemption over survival. Her obituary in the Lander paper was brief but respectful, noting her role in bringing down Dutch Mercer's gang and her decades of service to education in the territory. But the real memorial was in the lives she'd touched, the children she'd taught, the family she'd raised, the example she'd set of what it meant to be brave even when you were terrified, to do right even when it cost everything. At her funeral, Samuel told stories about his mother's courage and kindness. Clara Rose read from her mother's anonymous memoir, the words still powerful decades after they'd been written. The twins stood silent and strong, their presence a testament to the strength Martha had passed down through her children. And in the crowd were dozens of former students, people whose lives had been changed by Martha's patient teaching, who'd learned to read and write and dream of bigger futures because one woman had refused to let her own trauma define the limits of what she could give. They buried Martha beside Morgan on a hillside overlooking the ranch they'd built together with a simple stone that read, Martha Hayes Trent, 1855–1912. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, she was brave when it mattered most. And if you stood at that grave and looked out over the valley, you could see the ranch still thriving, still home to Trent descendants, still a testament to what 2 people could build when they chose love over fear, courage over compliance, redemption over resignation. The story of Martha and Morgan became family legend, passed down through generations of Trents. Great-grandchildren told their children about the woman who'd betrayed an outlaw gang to save innocent lives, and the cowboy who'd protected her when they came for revenge. The details sometimes shifted with the telling, becoming more dramatic or romantic or simplified, but the core truth remained. That courage could be found in the most unlikely places, that love could bloom even in the darkest circumstances, and that one choice, one moment of bravery, could change the trajectory of an entire life. In the end, Martha's legacy wasn't just the family she'd raised, or the school she'd founded, or the lives she'd saved by betraying Dutch Mercer. Her legacy was the example she'd set, that it was never too late to choose differently, to stand up for what was right, to accept the hand offered in love and build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been lost. She'd been broken and afraid and convinced she was beyond redemption, but she'd found the courage to try anyway, and that courage had been rewarded with a lifetime of love and purpose and joy. And somewhere, in whatever lay beyond this life, Martha and Morgan were together again, watching over the family they'd created, the land they'd tended, the life they'd built brick by brick and day by day through stubbornness and faith and absolute devotion to each other. They'd faced down outlaws and grief and all the ordinary challenges of a life well lived, and they'd emerged victorious not because they were perfect or fearless, but because they'd faced it together, hand in hand, their love the unshakable foundation on which everything else was built. That was the real story, the one that mattered most. Not the violence of that Saturday morning in South Pass City, not the dramatic shootout or the dead outlaws or even Martha's brave betrayal. The story that mattered was what came after, the 54 years of ordinary days and extraordinary love, of children raised and grandchildren cherished, of a ranch built and a community served, of two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together. It was a love story in the truest sense, not because it was easy or uncomplicated, but because it was real and hard-won and absolutely worth every sacrifice required to protect it. Martha had betrayed an outlaw gang to save innocent lives, and Morgan had protected her when they came for revenge. But the real triumph was everything that followed. The life they'd built, the love they'd nurtured, the family they'd raised, the legacy they'd left behind. And that legacy lived on in every Trent who worked the ranch, in every student who learned to read in the school Martha founded, in every person who heard the story and found the courage to make their own brave choice, to accept their own offered hand, to believe that redemption was possible, and love was real, and the future could be bright even when the present seemed impossibly dark. Martha Hayes had stood in an alley covered in blood and been offered a choice by a cowboy who believed she was worth saving. She'd taken that choice and changed her life, and in doing so had touched countless other lives, ripples spreading out from that one moment of courage to create waves of change and hope and possibility. That was the Wild West in its truest form. Not just outlaws and shootouts and dramatic confrontations, but ordinary people making extraordinary choices, building lives and families and communities from scratch, finding love in unexpected places and holding on to it with everything they had. It was harsh and beautiful and unforgiving and full of possibility, a place where the past didn't have to define you, where you could reinvent yourself through courage and hard work, and the love of someone who believed in you. Martha and Morgan had lived that truth, had embodied it in every choice they made and every day they spent together. They'd proven that it was possible to overcome trauma, to build something good from tragedy, to find happily ever after even when all the odds were stacked against you. All it took was courage, love, and the willingness to take that first terrifying step into an uncertain future, trusting that someone would be there to catch you when you fell. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.